One of the most unusual things about our religion is the extraordinary, painstaking details of every mitzvah. Every single mitzvah has an extraordinary amount of specific ways to do it. If you do it this way, you are yotzei. You fulfill the mitzvah. Do it that way, you're not. And if you think about it, it probably should beg a question. Why is the Torah so makbid? Let me give you an example. There is a mitzvah to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Now the Rambam is very clear in Hilchos Teshuvah as to the reason. He says, even though of course it's Gzeras HaKosav, but the underlying concept that we can relate to is Uru Yishena Mishenaschem. Wake up from your sleep. As the Rishonim explain, when you hear the thunder of that shofar, it awakens within you a sense of dread, of fear, of trepidation, and through that it brings you to tshuva. Okay, so I understand that. Yet I'd like to share with you that I have lived through many, many shofar blowings, and rare it is that I ever feel a sense of dread, trepidation, and I work on it. I work on the inyan of shofar. I work on the understanding behind it. And as a matter of fact, I'd like to share with you that there are many more fear-inspiring instruments. A French horn, a powerful trumpet. Yet it has to be a shofar from preferably a ram. It has to be complete. It can't have a crack in it. If it's from a parah, it's not kosher at all. And the question is why? And if that doesn't really get you, how about almost every single mitzvah that we have has such particulars that if you don't do it, you're not yotzei at all. You could have a beautiful pair of tefillin, one crack in one letter, and it's worthless. You did not fulfill the mitzvah. If you wore that pair of tefillin for 80 years and it wasn't complete, it didn't have every letter in the right order, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah at all. But even more than that, if the parshios were written in the wrong order, if the shel yad was written before the shel rosh, or put in the wrong order in the box, potentially you wouldn't be yotzei. And the question is why? Why would the Torah be so particular? You had the parshios there, you're missing a letter. Why does it have to be so exact? Why does it have to be so specific? And I believe that this question underscores something that we're not normally focused on, and it's a very, very big yesod in all of our avodas Hashem. And to understand this, let me bring you back to a different part of history. If you go back in history, maybe 300 years ago, if you go back to the Revolutionary War period in the United States of America, you would find a vastly different world than the world we live in now. Food, clothing, furniture, tools were so scarce. As a matter of fact, almost everything was made by hand by the people themselves who used them. How did you get a shirt in colonial times in America? The housewife would make the shirt. But what that meant in plain, simple language was she spun the wool. And then she set up a loom. And then she weaved together the fabric. And then she dyed that wool, which meant she had to cook the dyes, put the fabric in it, leave it out to dry. She had to then cut it, stitch it. A shirt, one shirt, took weeks and weeks. How did you make furniture? Let's say a woman said to her husband, I would like a new dining room table. The man would go out with an axe, fell some trees, then he would have to plane the wood, he'd have to line the wood up, he'd have to cut them and saw it. It was weeks and weeks, months. And the average person living 300 years ago lived such a different life that it's hard to imagine. And just as an illustration, I want you to imagine for a minute that we took a man who lived 300 years ago and brought him into our world. He'd be astonished, not by the technological advances, he'd be astonished by the abundance, the plenty. How do you have so much stuff? By the way, when the U.S. Mint first began printing coins in the beginning of the United States of America, the Mint printed 1 million pennies in 3 years. The first 3 years of operations, they produced 1 million pennies. The U.S. Mint today produces 1 million pennies in about a half hour, because now we have machinery. We have sophisticated machines that makes one man so much more productive that it's hard to imagine. In that world of 300 years ago, if a man wanted to plow his field, he took an ox, and it took him hours and hours and hours. As a matter of fact, to produce 100 bushels, 5 acres, it took him well over 300 hours, because he had to do it all by hand or maybe with his ox. Today, there are huge combines, these phenomenally powerful machines that can do an entire huge field in a couple of hours. Harvesting grapes used to be a tremendous challenge, because grapes are ripe within a very small window of time, about 2 weeks. But the problem is, how do you get enough laborers to possibly pick all of the grapes in that short window of time? And for farmers back then, it was a huge challenge. They had to hire gangs of workers, a tremendous amount of extra workers to harvest the grapes so that they don't go bad on the vines. Today, one big machine, within a few hours, does row after row after row of vines. What one man today can do, it would have taken 1,000 men back then. My grandfather had a small factory in Germany, pre-World War II. And my father explained to me that his father, my grandfather, was a successful businessman. He hired many other tailors, and they would produce suits. And these suits he would then go sell. So I once asked my father, so tell me, about how many suits did they produce? Maybe 6 a week. Today, if you go to any factory in China, in India, you'll see machinery pumping out suits, thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands in a day. The production of the average human being has become so much more powerful because we multiply, we leverage by using machines. And I dare say, if you were to take a person from that world and bring him into our world, he'd be astonished. And just for the fun of it, let's imagine that you're in your home. You have a bunch of kids, and you have a good job, and it happens to be that someone from that world comes to visit you. And it happens to also be that it's moving day for you. Imagine for a minute you work for a national firm, and while they may not pay the largest salaries in the world, one of the benefits is that if you move, they bring in movers. So imagine this man comes to visit you on moving day, you're in your house, and he sees these 5 men running from room to room, taking clothes and blankets and pillows, and he says to you, how in the world do you have so much stuff? You must be the richest man in the city, the country. And you explain to him, no, I'm just a regular guy. So how in the world do you have 20 suits? How do you have so many shirts? How do you have so many shoes? See, in his world, no one had that much clothing. And you explain to him, well, we have machinery. What do you mean machinery? We have these things that sort of like they do things, and you show them a machine or two. Maybe you show them a vacuum cleaner. Maybe you show them a microwave oven. And he says to you, but where's the power? And you show him, well, it's in the wall. You see there's electricity. What's electricity? Well, it runs through the wall and it powers these things. And needless to say, he'd be astonished. He'd be amazed. He wouldn't have words to even begin to understand your world. But stranger still, imagine that they filled up that moving truck with all of your worldly possessions. And it's a huge truck because it's filled from one end to the other with all of your clothing materials and everything that you have. And then this man turns to you and says, I understand that you have all this stuff, but how in the world are you going to get enough horses to tie to that truck to move it? It's going to take 20 horses at least. And you say to him, 20 horses? What are you talking about? Come here. You ask one of the workers for the keys, and you turn on the engine, and the engine starts, and he says, but how does it go? He explained to me, push the gas, and it goes. What do you mean? It pulls this whole truck. How could it be? And again, in his world, there'd be no explanation. There is no way that pushing down a pedal could possibly move tens of thousands of pounds of material goods. It's just physically can't be. And the reason why in his mind it can't be is because he's living in a different world. And he doesn't understand the leverage. He doesn't understand the power. He doesn't understand that which we take for granted because we're so used to these things called machinery, called industrial power, called the world we live in. And I believe that concept is actually quite relevant to us. You see, ancient man saw God. If you spoke to a man living 1,000 years ago, he clearly saw Hashem in front of him. He put a seed in the ground, and weeks later up came something. And that something turned into wheat or corn, and there was no explanation. In his world, there was no understanding, and therefore, it had to be God. Ancient man didn't understand disease or germs, and when someone died young, he saw God. Ancient man saw God all day, every day, because he didn't understand causality, he didn't understand cause and effect, and he saw a world that baffled him, and the only explanation was God runs the world. The scientific revolution, the scientific method changed much of mankind's understanding. No longer was man locked away. The scientific method allowed human beings to delve into and understand the cause and the effect. And the scientific method really is a brilliant body of techniques to study phenomena, to watch what's observable, then to create theories, and then to test those theories. And mankind began uncovering tremendous amounts of depth behind what we live in our life. And the result of this great body of science is fantastic. We understand things. We understand cells, we understand seeds, we understand so much about life. And the scientific method and all that it brought brilliance, brought a tremendous new vista of understanding to mankind, and it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. However, it also brought another interesting phenomena. Many, many people also discovered something. I don't need God. I understand why a seed grows. There's RNA, and it directs the cells to split. It directs which part to become the bark, which part to become the cellulose. When man began understanding the systems behind what happens in nature, suddenly he felt, I don't need God. I know it all. And it's a little bit of a sad mistake that modern man makes, because what he's discovered is the system that God uses to run the world. But the mistake he makes is that he looks at God like some kind of cheap magician. Imagine there was a magician, and a magician had some sort of sleight of hand, and he pulled a rabbit out of his hat, and then he made cards disappear. And if we studied him long enough, we'd find his trick. Ah, that's the trick. Really, there's a trap door on the bottom. Really, there are mirrors, there's smoke. I get it. When you discover the magician's trick, the magic is gone. And you see the magician is no different than you and I, and therefore the magician is just like you and I. And apparently, modern science, or at least many scientists or many people, believe that now that we've discovered the trick, we've debunked God, we don't need God, God's out of the equation. The folly of that era is so huge that it's difficult to explain. What you've discovered is the mechanisms, the levers via which God runs the world. Nature is Hashem. Nature is God's predictable, planned method of running every aspect of this world. But if you've discovered rules, if you've discovered systems, you've discovered something that God created and maintains. You didn't debunk God. You've now uncovered but a small, tiny little bit of the vast wisdom of our Creator. But the opposite of debunking, now you're beginning to understand. Unlike ancient man who put a seed in the ground and didn't get it, now we could delve into the wonders, the vastness, the sophistication of the systems. And it's not that we don't need God, it's that now at least we begin on some level to understand the basics. But if the first mistake that modern man made was thinking he doesn't need God, there's another mistake that modern man made that might be maybe as egregious. At almost every stage of the scientific development, man came to this point where he says, now we get it. We know just about all that we need to know. And it's rather astonishing when you look back at hindsight and you see the arrogance of the leading minds of science when they think that they've conquered the last vista. They've conquered the final understanding. University of Chicago was opened up in 1894. Michelson was a famous scientist at the time, and his dedication speech is classic. The more important fundamental laws and facts of physical science have all been discovered, and these are now so firmly established that the possibility of their ever being changed is so remote that it's almost not even worth thinking about. That was in 1894, where mankind's understanding was so primitive. The atom, if it was known at all, was just a vague sort of concept. The cell even was just barely known. Quantum mechanics wasn't known. The depth of scientific understanding was at its most primitive stage. And just an illustration of it to see how far it went, towards the beginning of the 19th century, we're talking not long, 1899, there was a movement by Charles Duell, who then was in charge. He was the head of the patent office, and he argued for closing the patent office. He wanted to close the patent office. Why is that? Because in his words, all that is to be discovered has been discovered. This was in 1899. There was no microwave popcorn back then. No man on the moon, no computers. But in man's understanding, all that is to be discovered has been discovered. We have conquered all vistas. We know it all. And each generation uncovers new worlds, worlds that the previous generations couldn't even imagine, couldn't even envision. And each one thinks now we've arrived. Each one thinks now we have the understanding. And I believe that in a very real sense, even though maybe you'll argue with me that today people are a little bit more humble, and the vastness of the universe and the complexity of the laws are so awe-inspiring that maybe man has learned a little bit of humility, but I believe still not so. Because I believe that one of the great limitations of science is an extraordinarily limited concept. If my eyes see it, if my ears hear it, it exists, and if not, it doesn't exist. And as an illustration of this point, Albert Einstein, in his biography, Isaacson, writes that he was not the most gifted child in the world, but he had an incredible sense of curiosity. And at 5 years old, one day he was sick in bed, and his father brought him a compass. And Einstein describes in his words that when he examined this compass, and he saw that the needle would spin to the north, he saw it as strange powers. He literally began trembling, and he grew cold. He realized something deeply hidden had to be behind things, and that moment remained with him for the rest of his life. A huge, powerful sense of humility. I don't understand things. I fundamentally don't get it. One of the great mysteries of existence is something called life. A tree is alive, a rock isn't. A cell is alive, a grain of sand isn't. But what's the difference? Why is it that the cells gather together? Why is it that they form organs? Why is it that those organs form bigger organisms? What is driving it all? Why is it that it doesn't just sit there like any other inert object? And as much as modern man will come up with theories, the DNA and the genetic coding, it's all window dressing. And it never addresses the most fundamental question: what's making it work? What's making it all happen? And in existence is something that we have to call a life force, but it doesn't make sense because there's nothing in the physical world to explain it. There are no tooth fairies. There are no magical elves. But what makes the seed grow? What makes it develop? Why is it? And the Rambam explains, and it's something that you'll find over and over in almost all the Rishonim, that every physical entity has a corresponding spiritual entity. Anything in the physical world has a spiritual component to it. And the Rambam is very clear when he talks about the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars. Each one has a Bale Nefesh Videya. Each of them has we'll call it a malach. It's not a malach, but it's a existence, a thinking, intelligent sar, some spiritual force that are alive, chayim va'omdim. They exist and they recognize and understand and are responsible for that object. We say these words on Shabbos davening. Tovim ma'oru shabar Elokeinu Hashem, the luminaries, the sun, the moon, they're great. Bidas, you're created with tremendous wisdom. Smeichim b'seisam, they're joyful when they go out. V'sasim b'voam, they're satisfied when they return. Osim be'ema ritzon konam, they do with great fear the will of their Creator. If you study the words of davening, and you'll see this over and over, there are powerful spiritual forces that guide every feature in this world. And every physical entity has a spiritual counterpart. Chazal tell us that not a blade of grass grows without a malach above telling it to grow. What that means in plain, simple language is there is no difference between an inert object, sand, and a cell, except that one has a spiritual force that's guiding it, that's controlling it. And if you'd like to understand fundamentally life itself from a physical standpoint, it makes no sense. A human being lying there in a coma looks as dead as a doornail. A human being who is dead looks as much alive as someone who's dead. What's the difference? Physiologically, everything's there. The heart, the lungs, everything is intact. Yet he's dead. What does that mean? What does it mean he's dead? Well, his soul left. What does it mean, his soul? Everything that's alive has a nefesh, something that keeps it alive. Anything, if it's a tree, if it's a rock doesn't. If it's a tree, if it's a plant, it has a spiritual entity that keeps it alive. But anything that's in existence has a spiritual component that directs it, that keeps it. But far more than just being a part of it, it is responsible and actually keeps that item in where it's supposed to be and as it's supposed to be. The Derech Hashem explains that it's not a parallel universe. It's not like there's a physical universe and then there's a spiritual universe. It's that when Hashem created the world, Hashem created the spiritual forces to be responsible and to guide everything in the physical world. Every tree, every rock, every mountain has a spiritual element to it that keeps it in existence and that guides it. When the sun comes out in the morning, that malach, that sar, whatever you call it, brings it out, controls it. There are very exact laws that Hashem created via which it should follow, and it follows them dutifully, but it's a Baal Bechira. It's a logical, thinking, spiritual entity that has free will, could deny Hashem, could not listen to Hashem. And if you listen to the words in davening many, many times, we describe the tremendous shira, the praise that the upper world sing to Hashem. And you have to understand, they're not billions of boom boxes. They're not tape recorders just saying words. They're balidea, understanding, just like you understand, I have free will, you have free will. They are like us. They're not blinded by physicality. They're not put into a body so that they get drunk and get all confused. But they fully can listen or cannot. They have decision-making ability, and they decide, obviously, what's good, what's right, what's proper, because Hashem commanded it, and they follow dutifully. And the sad reality is that while we are very, very sophisticated in terms of physical science, and we understand much of the mechanisms behind the physical world, we are completely clueless. We are spaced out and clueless when it comes to an entire other dimension of reality. There's a losa say in the Torah, don't keep alive a machshefa. What's a machshefa? Kishuf it's called black magic. If I practice optical illusions, if I practice sleight of hand, that's not kishuf. Smoke and mirrors is not kishuf. Kishuf means I literally made that object disappear. The Sefer Chinuch explains, everything physical has a spiritual counterpart, and Hashem created various ways that a human being can manipulate the upper worlds. And if you manipulate the upper worlds which the lower worlds are turned to, are tied to, it changes the lower world as well. And if you'd like to understand Kishuf, it's that ancient man used to have understandings that modern man doesn't. And that is how to manipulate the upper worlds. When Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron HaKohen stand in front of Paro, it was an os, one of the signs. Aaron takes the staff, throws it on the floor, and it turns into a serpent. A nace, a miracle. If we would see it, we'd pass out. Could you imagine a stick, a big stick? He throws it on the floor and turns into a slithering live snake, a moface. Paro was not exactly moved. The Medrash tells us Paro called for the academy, the students in the academy, the children, because every child in the academy knew that trick. And they each took their staff, threw it on the floor, and it turned into snakes as Aaron's staff did. Okay, Aaron trumped them because his staff, after turning back into a staff, swallowed them all whole and was still the same size. But here's the point. School children were learned in upper world forces. They were fully aware, fully conversant, and they knew how to manipulate things in a way that we, modern man, with all our sophistication and all of our understanding, we don't have a clue. And if you study Chumash, you'll see this over and over. The Derech Hashem explains that there are things we're allowed to do and things we're not allowed to do. Kishuv is black magic we're not allowed to do. Sefer Yetzirah, which was written by Avram Avinu, is something that we're allowed to do. Now, you and I don't know how, but the Gemara brings down many examples of Tanoim, Amoraim, who would use Sefer Yetzirah. There are ways to manipulate the upper worlds in ways that are permitted. One example is two Tanoim was sitting in a field. Erev Shabbos, they created a cow and ate that cow on Shabbos. And it means to say they created a cow that they then shechted, prepared, ate on Shabbos. How do you create a cow? How do you create a cow? The answer is Hashem created this physical world tied to the upper world. And if you know how to manipulate the upper world, you change things. You make things appear, make things disappear. And with all of our sophistication, we live in a very, very clueless world. We look at people who serve the Avodah Zarah, who are idol worshippers. Primitives, what do you bow down to a totem pole? Come on, what kind of foolish guy are you? And it is true that many, many of the Ovdei Avodah Zarah were quite foolish. But it's also true that many of them were quite sophisticated. Because as the Rambam explains, what they were doing was tapping into forces of nature, Hashem created various levels and various arrangements of things. And when they worshiped the sun or the moon, it wasn't the physical sun or the physical moon. It was that sar, that spiritual force behind it. And they thought they could influence it to help them. And apparently, to some extent, they could. You study Bilam, you study even Lavan, you see they had tremendous powers. And while we are so sophisticated, we're also clueless. And as people living in this society, it's time for us to sort of open our eyes and recognize that that which my eye sees isn't the only dimension. And it's a little ironic because we're very comfortable with that. You and I speak on a cell phone. You pick up a cell phone. There are no wires. And yet you expect me to believe that I could speak to my brother in Eretz Yisrael 6,000 miles away? How could that be? Well, you see, there's this little device over here. It sends out a microwave to a satellite 3 miles in the sky. And that satellite communicates to another satellite. And that sends it to a relay station, which sends it to another, which finds this. Oh, come on. You expect me to believe that? Do you expect me to believe that if I pick up this phone, I'm going to speak to him? And even better, try it on FaceTime. When you see the face, I don't get it. How could it be? My eye doesn't see microwave. I don't see electricity. I don't see electricity coursing through the walls. I don't see x-rays. I don't see any of these things that I'm so comfortable with and so much aware of. And I believe the point is that whilst we get very comfortable with what science teaches us, we also have to take a lesson. And that lesson is that which my eye sees is not the end of existence and is not the end of the world. And every physical entity has a spiritual part behind it. And that spiritual part is larger, more prominent, and is responsible for the physical part. If you'd like to understand modern man with all of his great wisdom, if you'd like to understand what it's like, I want you to imagine the following. Imagine that you and I went to a remote part of Africa. And we found a tribe that had almost no exposure to civilization. And from that tribe, we took a man, a very primitive man, who lived still with his loincloth and his spear. And we put him on a plane. And on this plane, we're getting closer to JFK. And as we're coming down, we're landing. We point out, look at that. You see the Van Wyck? You see all those cars? And he says, oh, look at that car in and out and out. He says, wow, it's wondrous what you guys have invented. I mean, things that drive themselves, that just go by themselves. And you say to them, they don't drive themselves. Each car is a driver. What do you mean driver? They're tiny. What do you mean driver? In his primitive understanding, he sees little vehicles. He assumes they move on their own. He doesn't recognize that every car has a driver. And that if there wasn't a driver, the car would stop or crash, but it wouldn't get to its destination. What we have to recognize as well is that every physical entity in the world has forces guiding it. And much like a car has a driver, if those forces weren't there, it wouldn't get to its destination. When you come home Friday night and you say, Shalom Aleichem, you sing those verses, you're singing to the malachim that escorted you back from shul to your house. Every action that a person does creates a malach. Chazal tell us if you do a mitzvah, it creates a powerful malach on the good. If you do something opposite, it creates a powerful malach on the bad. Would you like to understand why there's such painstaking detail in every mitzvah? It's because every mitzvah has powerful impact, powerful effects, not in the physical world, but in the upper worlds. When Hashem created the human being, Hashem put us into a position of power. Hashem put us into a world that we can control. If we use the physical world in the right way and the right time, it creates tremendous changes in the upper world, and we may not see it, but effective it is. And much like a powerful machine, it does far more than anything I could ever imagine, far more than I could do with my bare hand. And much like if you were to take a primitive man from 300 years ago even, and bring him into our world, he would never imagine the productivity of the average human being. How does one man pull 10,000 pounds? What do you mean you push on the gas? It can't be. He doesn't recognize machinery. He doesn't recognize levers. He doesn't know that world. So he'll never understand. But when you begin understanding that there are different worlds, you begin to understand that when Hashem put us into this world, Hashem gave us tremendous opportunities to change the upper world, which changes this world, which becomes my world to come forever. But the impact and the effect are far beyond anything I could do in the physical world. I may think I'm powerful, I'm strong. I'm very, very corporeal, very physical, very limited. But if I use these powerful machines, then I change upper worlds. But of course, much like any machine, there are rules, laws, how it has to be used. If you don't plug the vacuum cleaner into the wall, it's not going to work. If you don't put gas in the tank, the car is not going to go. And if you drop your cell phone into a sink full of water, it's not going to function. Do you know why there's such an incredible, painstaking detail? It's for exactly that reason. The mitzvahs that Hashem gave us change upper worlds. They have tremendous, tremendous impact. Powerful machines that do more than we could ever imagine. But of course, much like any machine, it has to be functional. And if in your tefillin there's one letter that's touching the other, or there's a letter missing, or it's cracked, it doesn't work. But why? I'm a good guy. I paid money. I tried. You're a good guy and feel bad, but you didn't use the machine. And this is a very important concept and a very powerful lesson, because if you don't focus on this, you will not understand much about our religion at all. If you take a cow, and you take that leather, and you prepare that leather, l'shem tefillin, perfect, good for tefillin, you could write the parsha on it. Of course, you can't use it for Sefer Torah. Different level, won't work. And if you prepared it for mezuzah, great for mezuzah. It never works for tefillin. Or if you did it for tefillin, it'll work for mezuzah because it's progressive. It's mezuzah, tefillin, Torah. But why? Why? There's no explanation in the physical world. Because the physical world is corporeal, is thick. Once you understand that there are upper worlds, once you understand there's something called Kedusha. And Kedusha has very real rules to them. Not arbitrary. We may not understand them now. We may understand them more or less. But Chazal understood them. They give us very exact guidelines. And when you study any mitzvah, you see the extraordinary detail, because that detail matters, because it changes upper worlds, or it doesn't, based on whether in fact it's effective. If your lulav is split down the middle, it doesn't work. It just doesn't accomplish in the upper worlds what you'd like it to do. As much as you'll try, as much as you shake it, it's puzzle. If you have 4 spots on the top of it, and it's puzzle, you're done. Finished. If you have the wrong kavanah, doesn't work. But why? But why is a good question until you begin understanding what you're doing. And the truth be told, we'll never fully understand it, but when you focus on the fact that we're dealing with things way out of our normal understanding, way out of our dimension, you begin to get a certain glimpse and a certain understanding and perspective. And I have one more step I'd like to share with you. Of late, I've learned a new little habit. I've learned to daven in a complete whisper. Now, you may wonder, why do I daven in a complete whisper? It's usually b'kol. When you daven with a voice, it's ma'oreh, it awakens the kavanah. It's much easier. So the reason why I sort of learned to daven in a whisper is because I've gone to different minyanim at different times in my life, some of which are like a library, and I'm afraid of gezel shena. I'm afraid of waking up the guy next to me, and I don't want to be guilty of gezel shena, so I've learned to daven in a whisper. And if you think I'm being facetious, unfortunately I am, but there's some truth to it. If you go to certain minyanim, or you watch certain people daven, you're looking at someone who looks brain dead. And they may not have any kavanah whatsoever. And you may say, they're wasting their time. I mean, isn't tefillah supposed to be avodah shebelev? It's heart service. It's supposed to be connecting to my Creator. It's supposed to be an emotional appeal and connection and recognition of Hashem's presence. And it is. And while that's 100% true, I'd like to share with you a fascinating halacha. If you daven an entire shachris from beginning to end and don't have any kavanah at all, except for the first paragraph of Shema and the first brachas in Shemona Esrei, you are yotzei davening totally and completely. Meaning to say, everything that you could accomplish was accomplished. Maybe not to the highest level. Obviously, more kavanah is better. And if you really recognize and think about it and recognize you're speaking to Hashem, it's a much higher level. But you are yotzei. However, daven the most meaningful, significant Shemona Esrei in the world, connecting to Hashem, speak to Hashem right there, but forget Yalla v'Yava when you're obligated to, or say Tein Talamotar when you're not supposed to, and you're not yotzei. But why? But why? The but why is because while it's true that kavanah is essential for davening, and it's a huge part of it, it's but a part. You see, every mitzvah has the mitzvah itself, and every mitzvah has hidurim, additional things. And you should work on davening, and you should work on having kavanah, but you should also recognize that the words themselves are powerful, even if you space out. Even if you're totally not there, Chazal drafted those words with tremendous holiness, and they affect upper worlds. Shema, during Kabbalah's Al Malchus Shemayim, you have to accept Hashem's sovereignty. First pasuk of Shema, first brachas in Shemona Esrei. But other than that, if you davened an entire davening and had no kavanah whatsoever, you still had a tremendous effect on the upper world. And the reason why I share that with you is not because I think we should learn to be lazy in kavanah, quite the opposite. We should really learn to work on and grow, but because it shares with us an interesting perspective. And that is, I was gifted when Chazal created the various systems of my growth. When Hashem gave me the mitzvahs in the Torah, they're powerful implements, powerful tools, machines that change upper world, whether I know what I'm doing or not, whether I'm spaced in or not. And if I davened that whole Shemona Esrei totally, completely unconscious, but at least in the first bracha I had in mind of speaking to Hashem, bingo, I changed the upper world, I did tremendous things. I don't realize it. I take 3 steps back and say, where am I? Who am I? What am I? But the bottom line is they're powerful tools. And I think it's very important for us to recognize. You see, if we were to see a person who knew Kishuv, imagine we had one of Paro's kids, one of Paro's head magicians, and we saw him literally take water, throw it on the floor, and it turns into blood. Oh my goodness, wow, the power. We'd be astonished. We have much greater power. And we change the upper world. We're given powerful machines and powerful systems to use. But you got to use them. We don't live in the upper worlds. We never really will get that full understanding until we leave this physical existence. But it's very important to understand the impact in the upper worlds. Number one, because I learned to value the mitzvahs. And number two, I learned why it is that there are such details and specificity to every mitzvah. Why is it that if you take a kali bishul, something that's easily cooked, and you put it into a kli rishon, into a hot pot, on Shabbos, you're dead, you're toast. Put it into a kli shlishi, third, you're okay. Why? And in this physical world we live in, you'll never know an answer. You'll never understand borer, you'll never understand much of any malacha, you'll never understand any of the mitzvahs. Once you understand that these are powerful tools, Hashem warned us against things that change the upper worlds in a damaging sense. Hashem commanded us to do things that create powerful impacts and changes in the upper world. And every mitzvah that we engage in has a huge impact, miles and miles, leagues and leagues above anything you and I can imagine. But it takes a little while to sort of learn it, to understand it. I think there's a tremendous lesson to learn from exactly this point, the painstaking detail. Because when you see that, you understand we're dealing with a different world. When you understand that if you took a man from the 1700s and brought him into our world, he wouldn't understand our world. How do you have so much clothing? How does one man have such a big house? How could you possibly have cut so many trees? And you explain to him that I didn't cut the trees. there's this powerful combine that goes through a forest, just cuts it down like it's nothing. He can't relate to it because he doesn't understand machinery. And in that sense, it's difficult for us to understand the changes in the upper world, but that's something we have to work on. We have to work on understanding it. We have to work on recognizing it. And again, we don't live in the upper world. We'll never really be there, but it's important for us to recognize how much Chazal understood the impact, because then we could begin valuing the mitzvahs, and then we could begin being careful. Every single physical entity has a spiritual counterpart. That spiritual counterpart isn't just there. It's responsible for its existence. When I use anything in the physical world in its right way, I give it a kiyum, I give it reinforcement, strengthening, I elevate it. I don't elevate the chair I sit in, but that chair has a spiritual component. I elevate that and it becomes more of a davar shebekadusha, it becomes holy. What do you mean it becomes holy? Holy chair? It's a holy chair. Why? Because I used it properly. And you and I may not see it, but that's the impact, that's the effect. And when you begin studying these things and realizing it, you understand the powerful, powerful impact that we can have. And again, the opposite, because Rahman al-San, it could be disastrous. I think there's a tremendous lesson. When you take a man of the ancient world, a man who had machinery, and those machines produced 1,000,000 pennies in 3 years, and you explain to him the phenomenal productivity that we have, he'd be aghast. That's us to the upper world. We also have to recognize one of the great shortcomings of science, and that is that in his arrogance, man believes he replaced God. I don't need God because I know the systems, I know the mechanisms. I debunk God. You found the system via which God runs the world, but you understand but a tiny, tiny little bit. Because even if you were merited understanding all of the physical world, that's not the underpinnings of it. That's not the life force. That's not what's keeping it in existence. There's a whole other dimension. And while we're very sophisticated in the physical sciences, we're extraordinarily primitive in the spiritual ones. And that's something that we need to think about, something we need to understand. And I want to close with one little story that I think is very eye-opening. There was a fellow who was in college, not religious, he was Jewish, and he was in a fraternity, and it was a fraternity party, and they're all drinking and doing whatever they're doing, and somebody discovered, one of the fellows in the fraternity discovered that there were some scrolls on the walls. Apparently there was a Jewish fraternity, there were some scrolls, and he took them off the wall, and they were mezuzahs. And this fellow Mark was one of the fellows in the group, and this other guy found these scrolls, showed them to Mark and said, "Hey, these are cool, let's burn them. Let's burn them and we could have like a little fire." And Mark said, "You can't do that. You can't do that, they're holy." And the fellow said to Mark, "What do you mean they're holy?" "They're holy, they're a scroll." "What do you mean they're holy?" the fellow said to Mark. "I don't know, but you can't burn them, they're holy." And the fellow turned to Mark and said, "You expect us to care when you don't even know what they are?" That night, Mark went to bed, tears streaming down his cheeks, because he didn't know what it meant that they were holy, and he didn't know what it meant. And he went on to discover what they were about, what they meant. And in a very real sense, I think that's us. As sophisticated as we may be, we're much like Mark. We don't get it. We don't understand it. Tefillin, tzitzit, mezuzah, whatever. I don't know. And you have to delve in. You have to understand. The most we'll get is but an inkling. But that inkling opens our mind's eye. I'm changing the upper world by doing these things. I'm changing things to an extent I can't envision or imagine. But it has to be exact. It has to be the way Chazal said it, the way Hashem said it, because only then does it accomplish. When we recognize the value, the incredible opportunity, it's empowering, it's invigorating, because we recognize the power that Hashem gave us, the opportunity to change myself, change the upper world, and accomplish tremendous things that Hashem gave to each of us.